All right. Welcome everyone to our special program this evening for Mount Diablo Audubon Society. My name is Ariana Rickard and I'm the program chair and vice president for Mount Diablo Audubon, and I'm so thrilled that you can join us this evening with our special guest. Tiana Williams-Claussen is the Yurok Wildlife Department director. She previously, before this role, she studied biochemical sciences at Harvard and took a postgraduate internship with the Yurok Tribe and was the first employee hired for the Wildlife Department that started in 2008. And so she is going to be talking about the Condor program. So I think in general, if you want to change your view in the Zoom, you'll see that in the top right, you'll see a tab that you can click on that says view. You can change it from full screen to standard. And we ask that you please keep yourself muted during Tiana's presentation. You can use the chat for questions, but we prefer that you hold your questions to the end. And I think maybe that's it for the Zoom overview. So welcome, Tiana. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for the welcome and the introduction, and just thank you for the invitation to be here and talk about my program. And of course, thanks to everybody who's come today. I'm so happy that you're interested in hearing about us. But so again, my name is Tiana Williams-Claussen. I'm the director of the Yurok Tribe's Wildlife Department, and I'll talk a little bit about who we are at the Yurok Tribe a little bit more into the presentation. But I'm happy to talk about the Northern California Condor Restoration Program, which from my perspective, both as a tribal biologist and a tribal member, really means cultural and ecological restoration in the Pacific Northwest, which is where we're based. A little bit more about myself. I am a Yurok tribal member. I come from the village of Weshkwell, which is along the Klamath River, which is where our primary reservation lands are on. I went off to school with the aim of acquiring the skills necessary to come back and serve my community, and kind of honestly fell into this postgraduate internship, which evolved into becoming a wildlife technician. Actually, the first employee of the newly spawned wildlife program, which was started with the flagship project of bringing condors back home to Yurok ancestral territory. So Condor is really how I got my career started and how I got to be where I am today. But so I'm going to start with a little bit of an overview of the bird themselves. If you're interested in this, you probably know who Condor is, but there's some interesting biological facts I always like to share, and go in a little bit about who we are as the Yurok tribe and why this is so important to us. Touch briefly on what we've done so far to get where we're at, which is nearing reintroductions in our homeland, and what the next steps are going to be for Yurok recovery, or for Condor recovery in Yurok country. Let's see. And my screen is not advancing. Is it advancing for you guys? Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
There we go. So this is a condor, Prey-go-neesh in the Yurok language. They're a super cool bird. They are actually the largest land-based bird in North America, with a wingspan of 9 to 9.5 feet. They can weigh as much as 25 pounds when you're talking about a big male. And we say that their lifespan is unknown because they're a very long-lived bird. And we've actually not been studying them long enough to know how long they can live. We do know that their near cousin, the Andean condor in South America, under ideal situations of living in captivity, can actually live as much as 80 years. So presumably a California condor's lifespan is somewhat similar. Their role, ecologically speaking, is that of a giant obligate scavenger. So basically they're a giant vulture, which you might be able to tell just by looking at them. And of course, that's the very important ecological niche that they fill, and which hasn't been filled in Yurok country for over 100 years now, that being when they were extirpated locally. I have no idea if you can hear my 3-year-old screaming in the background. I have no idea what's going on there, but I'm sure my husband will deal with it. But I apologize if it's coming through, and I hope everything's okay. Anyway, that's life for you. Condors are a monogamous species, so they typically form lifelong pair bonds. They really focus on being good parents, with only one egg born every other year, which they'll raise for full 2 years. they'll actually incubate that egg for 56 to 58 days, and that chick won't fledge for 6 to 7 months, which is a very intensive period for, I mean, most birds come nowhere near that. The birds themselves don't reach full maturity until about 6 to 8 years old. And all of this is just really important information because it ties into their status as an endangered species, both under federal and California law. And that has to do with their relative reproductive rate versus their relative mortality rate, which is unfortunately pretty high. So, but just as a comparison, we like to state, for example, an eagle, which is, a kind of similarly sized bird, kind of halfway fills a similar niche. But an eagle can have as many as 2 to 3 chicks in a year, whereas a condor only has 1 chick every 2 years. In a 10-year period, you could have 20 to 30 new eagles, whereas you'd only have 5 new condors. So that reproductive rate is really important to their endangered status right now. Their approach, I guess you'd say, has actually really worked well for them prehistorically, we'll say. They used to range all the way up into what's now British Columbia, down into what's now Mexico, across what's now the United States, and up into New York, kind of in that Pleistocene epoch. And the causes for this are unknown, but by the 1850s, their range had shrunk to something like this kind of grayish brown area you see here. Still up into British Columbia, still down into Baja California, but definitely considerably shrunken along their kind of like eastern border there. By the 1950s, their range had shrunk to that red wishbone that you see in the middle of California. It got so bad that the condor population actually reached an all-time low of 22 individuals by 1982 in the entire world, making them pretty much the most endangered bird in the country. And those mortality factors were, as so often seems to be the case, almost entirely human caused. So some factors that all contributed to this were, with the westward push of settlers and colonization, there's just a lot more humans. So there's a lot more people to feed. And so there was a reduction in the megafauna that condors rely on. So that's California sea lion, elk, deer, not only because there's more people, but because there's also the introduction of market hunting. So just more killing than needed to happen necessarily for money. There was also direct human take. People would harvest the birds, people would harvest the eggs. It's just these really cool things that they saw. There was habitat loss in our own region, which is in far northern California. That meant the loss of the old growth redwood forests, which they rely on for nesting and roosting. It meant the loss of the prairies, which actually Native peoples maintained through prescribed fire in pretty large abundance. Either because they were planted over for timber harvest or because fire was repressed. And so the prairies became encroached upon. Our traditional prairies are actually only 1% of what they were pre-contact. They're a very important habitat because they support those large species like elk and deer and bear that condors rely on. There's what we call incidental poisoning. People would put out poisoned carcasses for wolves or other animals that they didn't want feeding on their livestock, and condors would eat it and die. And then there's actually 2 main issues that still remain a problem today, which is residual DDT contamination in the environment and lead toxicity, which actually is the #1 killer of condors in the wild. You can see the radiograph on the right of the screen is actually an image of a condor taken with some lead pellets in its gut. So it's actually the use of lead ammunition that's been implicated for this. And I'll talk quite a bit more about that since, like I said, it is a #1 leading cause of mortality even today. In any case, the high mortality rates in the mid-1980s drove the very controversial decision to bring all remaining birds into captivity with the aim of starting a captive rearing program. And there was no idea at the time if it would work, if they would even breed in captivity. But as you can see by this egg, which is being candled to check its health at the San Diego Wild Animal Park, I think it's called San Diego Global at this point, which is one of the rearing facilities. It actually was very successful. And within just a few years, they had condors breeding in captivity. It was so successful that by the mid-1990s, they are actually re-releasing birds into the wild, such that as of December 2020, they kind of give us these annual numbers. There's actually 504 birds total, with 329 living in the wild. If you'll hark back to that number I cited before, that's much better than the 22 individuals from the mid 1980s. But the question remains, in light of continuing anthropogenic threats, is something like this sustainable? And so this was actually a photo taken by the former California Condor Recovery Program manager, Jesse Grantham, of the condor looking over a Southern California city. You can see that there's a potential for quite a bit of interactions between humans and condors in these more populated areas where condors are currently persisting through management. So issues that remain an issue are power line collisions, lead toxicity, and I say organochlorines here, again, that's referencing that residual DDT. The Yurok tribe actually, many, many years ago now, had a different dream. And I always just love this picture by our local artist, Gary Bloomfield, depicting condors flying over the relatively pristine rivers of the Pacific Northwest, coming home to the Pacific Northwest. We do have relatively low populations up here. It's a very different dynamic than some of the more densely populated areas in California. Well, as a tribal member, I can look at our landscape and see how heavily it was impacted compared to some regions. It's still very clean. It's still very beautiful. So there's seems to be a lot of opportunity for condor to thrive up here. But to get back to that particular locale, to get back to who we are as the Yurok tribe, this is where we're located, as I mentioned previously, in far northern California. That kind of red polygon, that red almost rectangular shape, is our ancestral territory. The red boundary that you see along actually the Klamath River going through the middle of that is our reservation. And so our reservation is kind of a jurisdictional boundary in the same way that California is a jurisdictional boundary. We don't actually own the land in there necessarily, but we have jurisdictional authority to make laws and regulation and to manage the people and resources within that reservation. And it's only 10% of our traditional territory. And of that 10%, we actually only own a small portion of the lands within the reservation, the rest being owned by other parties like timber companies or other private landowners, or, as you can see in the green, actually redwood national and state parks. And so we actually have a very unique relationship with redwood national and state parks because some of their jurisdictional lands cross over into the reservation. And I'm not 100% sure of this, but I think we might be the only national park in California where you actually have kind of that cross jurisdiction of boundaries. But in any case, the green boundary is Redwood National Park, and they have been our staunch partners in this since the very beginning, before the Wildlife Department even got started, which was back in 2008. We knew that we wanted condors to come home, and we had approached them in 2007 to say, hey, we think that our mission to restore this incredible bird to this region meshes really well with your mission of preservation and conservation and just the incredible landscape that you manage. And they very enthusiastically joined with us at that time. So that little oval you can see in there is the general region where we'll be releasing them. So it kind of is right in the boundary and kind of the crossover of our ancestral territories and that's that Redwood National and State Park boundary. The little inset map in the corner, the yellow dots are where there are existing release facilities in California. So that's the Ventana Wildlife Society, Pinnacles National Park, and the site managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service down in the south. And so we're quite a large northward jump into their historical range in bringing condors back home here. So the reason that we're doing this is in part mandated by our Yurok Constitution, which was driven by the kind of ethos and mores of the Yurok people. And so there's two primary components of the Constitution which relate to condor reintroduction, which is to preserve and promote our culture, language, and religious beliefs and practices, which they relate to in perpetuity for our children and forever, and to restore and enhance the tribal fishery, water rights, forests, and all other natural resources, which include, of course, our wildlife community members. The decision was ultimately made by the Tribal Park Task Force, many of whom are pictured here. And that decision was actually made all the way back in 2003. And the Tribal Park Task Force was a task force of tribal elders who were specifically identified for their ability to prioritize natural and cultural restoration needs for the Yurok people, which was abundant because, of course, our region underwent quite a bit of drastic change after contact. And their decision to return condors largely relates to our cultural relationship with him. As in Yurok belief, condor is poitwasan, or one of the highest of the animals, spiritually speaking. In the words of our former councilman and one of our cultural leaders, Richard Myers, it can soar the highest, so we figured that was the one to get our prayers to heaven when we are asking for the world to be in balance. And many Yurok families, for that reason, teach that he's never to be harmed, and any feathers that we receive, which we use in our regalia, are considered to be gifts from the birds. In particular, he's particularly important to our what we call our high dances, our world renewal ceremonies, the jump dance and the white deerskin dance. Our world renewal ceremonies relate to our reason for being as Yurok people, as all the tribal people in this area. We consider ourselves to be world renewal people. It is our sacred duty to keep the world in balance, to help heal any harms, and to just move us all forward in a good way. So these are incredibly important ceremonies for us, kind of our highest reason for being. And our relationship goes all the way back to the beginning of time, before even people were on the scene, and the animals of the world, the spirits of the world, were kind of devising how we would move forward in a good way. And so it was at that time that the condor developed and gave us his song, which we use as a prayer in these ceremonies. It was at that time that he decided to provide his feathers and his spirit to the dance. He's considered to be very good-hearted in nature, to have a very pure spirit, which is then what goes into those dances to help bring the world into balance. And we believe that he carries our prayers to the heavens when we're dancing these dances, in order that that good energy can be spread over the whole world. So, and this is, I often stumble when I get to this slide because it's such a complex sort of thing to describe. But for us, at least, condor is both an ecological and a cultural keystone species. And so an ecological keystone species is there's various definitions, but one of them that I've always been fond of is a species which has an inordinate impact on its ecosystem relative to kind of its population or abundance. Condors themselves are not a super abundant bird by nature, of course, because they only have that one offspring every 2 years. They kind of took the approach of a long life and many offspring, but at the same time, just that kind of approach doesn't result in a wildly abundant thousands upon thousands of individuals. But they still have a very important impact. Of course, the one very important thing is that they are an obligate scavenger, as mentioned. We do have our local turkey vulture, and he does a great job. But the thing about condors is he's quite a bit larger, and he can actually get into a much larger category of animals than turkey vultures can. So, for example, a problem here that we have is whales or California sea lions or seals that wash up on our shores and then just bloat because we don't really have a scavenger who utilizes those resources effectively. The turkey vultures can't break into that thick blubber layer, for example, and open it up for themselves or for other scavengers. Condors provide that role. They can not only feed on them themselves, but then they also open up those carcasses for other animals to then access, and ultimately end up cleaning something that right now there's no animal that can help us clean up. Their role but then they've also got a much larger role. This is really where I stumble. They have a larger ecological role, I'd say, because of the way that they integrate with us as a cultural keystone species. And a cultural keystone species is a species that substantively impacts the way that a culture develops in a region. And so our culture as Yurok people and surrounding tribal people has definitely been impacted by Condor, who's so important to our ethos as a world renewal people. And because he's so integral to our role as world renewal people, and because our world is so damaged by not having him in it, we are completely driven to bring him home in a good way, which means making sure that he has a safe and healthy home to come home to. As I mentioned before, a lot of the problems that are faced by condors are human caused, and a lot of the solution for condors are going to be human mediated. And so I call him this kind of ties back into that ecological keystone species because of his relationship to our culture and everybody who loves Condor's culture, because he drives us to improve the ecosystem because of our relationship with him. So it's a really interesting dynamic. He brings a lot to the table just by existing, but then also by actually, improving the world directly as well. So one of the ways that this really hits home for me as a tribal member and as a tribal biologist is just looking at all the ways that condors near extirpation and our near extirpation have gone hand in hand, almost lockstep since colonization. So of course they suffered from the reduction in megafauna I mentioned. So did we, because these are species that we relied on not only for food, but for utility, but for ceremony, people that we had lived with in relationship and which had been taken from us as they were taken for condors. And so we dwindled. There was direct human take of condors because they were considered animals. They were considered to be lesser beings. In the same way, we suffered from massacres and from the theft of our children to the boarding schools in order to be remade in the colonizer's image, which is still having lasting repercussions. It really wasn't that long ago. I mean, my grandparents' generation was sent off to the boarding schools. They suffered from habitat loss. We suffered from removal from our home. It's really hard to be Native. I'm not going to say it's impossible in any way, because more power to everybody has been removed from their home, but it's really hard to be Yurok if you can't engage with the landscape that you were born into. And of course, there's poisoning and DDT and lead toxicity that kind of correlates to a lot of new toxic elements that were brought to us as tribal people and which have caused us a lot of problems as well. So really, I guess this just exemplifies that, as I think that our world is getting to be a lot better across all peoples. But certainly there was a time in American history that was very destructive and which did not take into account all of the repercussions of some of the actions that were being taken. And I do think we're in a much better place than we were when these things were happening. But you can see the direct tie that as the world was made inhospitable for condors, we were actually making the world inhospitable for ourselves as well. And the reverse is going to be true. This probably hit us most deeply in terms of our actual ceremonies. Because almost at the same time as condors were disappearing from our world, like I said, a little over 100 years ago now, very shortly after there, we almost lost the white deerskin dance, and that's what's depicted here. I didn't mention before that this image that this is taken from, which I showed earlier, is by local artist Lynn Risling, who's of Yurok, Karuk, and Hupa descent. And I love her work because it shows how vital these ceremonies remain to us. They're not something from the past, they're something that we continue to live. But about the time that we were losing condors, we almost lost the white deerskin dance itself as well, because of these dedicated efforts to eradicate the Yurok people and the Yurok way of life. And so it was actually one of the eldest of our elders who was a leader in reinstituting the white deerskin dance after many years. He was one of the last few elders who'd actually danced it in his youth. And so it was two and a half generations between when he danced and when he started to reinstitute it. And this again kind of parallels, I mean, it ended up being obviously not just him, but a whole host of tribal elders, not only from the Yurok tribe, but the Hupa tribe, Karuk tribe, everyone who had knowledge of these ancestral dances coming together to make these dances, these world renewal ceremonies, these high ceremonies, come to life again, because they all had this commitment to restoration. In the same way, condors came to the very brink of extinction. And if it hadn't been for this just joint community love of these birds and of the world that they should persist in, I mean, I just really love the parallel there. I love that we both, I mean, I don't love that we both nearly came to extinction, but I love that that was a reality, and it was the love of restoration. It was the love of conservation that brought people together to bring people back from the brink of destruction. So there's just a ton of parallels between Condor, between tribal people. And so I'm really honored and proud to be a part of Condor's restoration, with the understanding that I'm also being a part of not only Yurok restoration, but our neighboring tribes restoration and the restoration for anybody who loves Condor. and a healthy ecosystem. So in any case, these dances are healing the world again. I think that has a lot to do, because I believe in the power of our prayers, with a lot of the other restoration that's going on in Yurok country. So for example, if any of you are aware of it, there's a major dam removal program going on along the Klamath River. It's going to bring a lot of healing to our salmon populations and everybody who relies on it. There's a lot of language revitalization. Our language was highly endangered, still is, but we went from a population of 12 fluent speakers to, I don't know how many. We call them second generation fluent because it'll never be quite what it was, but it's alive again. It's gonna make it again. There's ceremonial revitalization. There's bringing health and happiness to our youth. Just in a lot of ways, our world is becoming healthy and whole again. And I think it has to do with these world renewal ethos and prayers that we're reinstituting. And all of that got very deep. So I'm going to move on to, I guess, a little bit more of the physical application of how this works, a brief history of our project, or in other words, how did we get where we are now with bringing condors home, which is a very near reality. And so the Tribal Park Task Force actually made the decision to bring home condors all the way back in 2003. And our director of the Office of Self-Governance at the time, and the Office of Self-Governance is kind of the state department for tribes. It kind of works with other entities in order to help meet tribal priorities. It took him several years to actually work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to get a project going. And so we actually received funding in 2008 from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Tribal Wildlife Grant Program to begin a feasibility analysis of what it would take to bring condors home to Yurok ancestral territory. And so there were some primary questions that went along with that, including, is there available habitat for condors to carry out necessary life history activities? So that's like feeding, nesting, roosting, being able to have flight corridors and flight capacity. Because while we knew historically they had thrived here, we also knew that the world had changed quite a bit since they had, and could it mean that they would persist in our homeland again? Excuse me, my cat's trying to get in and I'm afraid he's being too loud. Come on, dude. Another major question that we had was, will marine mammal-derived organochlorine contaminant levels limit recovery in Northern California? Again, that's referencing DDT. If some of you are familiar, it causes eggshell thinning and reproductive failure. And it remains a problem for some California flocks, California condor flocks in California. The next question being, will lead limit recovery in Northern California? And then as a corollary to that, what are the attitudes of Northern California hunters, and will they accept non-lead ammunition as a viable alternative? So that took like a decade, and I'm just gonna skim over most of it. But our habitat analyses indicated that at least there still seemed to be ample high quality condor habitat. Even though our prairies are only 1% of what they used to be, they are still in relative abundance to a lot of places out there. Even though our redwood forests are much smaller than they used to be, they're still quite a bit protected in redwood national and state parklands. And because of conservation initiatives that have come into place since condors were extirpated, our wildlife populations are much more abundant than they used to be, and should very easily be able to handle adding the scavenger back into the system. The question of DDT took a little bit longer to study. We actually did something like a 5-year study along the coast, all the way up to Oregon and down to about Fort Bragg, California, looking specifically at marine mammals, so California sea lions, harbor seals, any whales that we came across that had washed up and died on our shores. And so the reason that we focused on marine mammals is actually DDT and its breakdown metabolites, DDE and DDD, are lipophilic, so fat binding, and bioaccumulative. They will build up in fat in the body of an animal over time. And these animals, for example, a California sea lion can live as much as 30 years, and so it has quite a bit of time to bioaccumulate this contaminant. It was banned in the 1970s, but there's actually a lot of contaminated material still out in the ocean. Some of you may be familiar with the Montrose chemical spill, or the fact that not too long ago, really, they just found a brand new batch of like 25,000 barrels of DDT that had just been dumped in the Southern California Bight. Our concern was that particularly long-ranging animals like California sea lions or whales would go to more contaminated areas, bioaccumulate DDT, then come back to our shores and die and be kind of DDT bombs in our area. And of course, the problem with DDT, as I mentioned, is it's an eggshell thinner. This is an example of a healthy egg that hasn't been contaminated by DDT from Southern California. They don't really use a lot of the coastal resources there. And it has what's called the surface crystalline layer. The surface crystalline layer offers strength and integrity and water retention to an egg. And so this is an example from the Central California flock managed by Ventana Wildlife Society in Pinnacles National Park. And it has been contaminated by DDT and it's missing that surface crystalline layer. So it causes egg malformation, it causes egg thinness, so it'll break, and it causes loss of water. So without intervention, and unfortunately sometimes with intervention, an egg like this just won't make it. But our findings were actually very encouraging. If you look at the red bar all the way on the left, that's actually California sea lions that were studied in Southern California, so highly contaminated by DDT. But there's very clear kind of downward trend as you head north along the coast of California and up into Washington, where levels just drop off. That central bar that says 76.7 is Central California, where the existing flock is for the Ventana Wildlife Society. And it's about fourfold higher than our levels here. And so the good news about the Ventana flock is, while it is still being impacted by DDT, about 50% of their eggs laid are reproductively viable. They don't need any sort of intervention. And because we've banned the use of DDT in our area, in the United States, DDT levels are only expected to continue to go down. And so it's just a matter of time for them before their populations are on the upward swing with reproduction without intervening in egg health and things like that. So I can't say that we won't have a reproductive problem in Northern California. The proof is going to be in the pudding to see how much this level actually impacts bird reproduction. But being fourfold lower, that leaves me pretty encouraged that we're going to have less of a reproduction problem here in Northern California. So the big thing that we did as well was an assessment of blood lead burden within surrogate species, turkey vultures and common ravens, because of course we don't have condors up here to study. We picked these animals which have a similar diet to condors to see if they were getting lead contamination. And I mean, of course, what's wrong with lead? We all know that it's poisonous and it affects behavior and development and is now known to affect virtually every system in the human body as a potent neurotoxin. It's actually been, the CDC has actually come out to say that you should not feed children under the age of 5 with game that has been hunted with lead ammunition, which has again been implicated with how it's getting into the system because of the deep neurological effects that it can have on them. And it's not a proven sort of thing in that case. It's kind of just a safety recommendation. Oftentimes humans who digest food differently than condors do may be less impacted, but of course you don't want to take that risk with your little ones. But this is an example of a deer that was harvested with lead ammunition, and lead being the most conventional material for ammunition in this day and age. So the thing about lead is it's actually a soft metal. So when it impacts an animal, it will actually fragment into hundreds of pieces. There are 547 fragments of lead in this deer thorax. And on the one hand, that actually kind of works for harvesting an animal because each of these little bits of lead carries with it kinetic energy. And so it leads to a clean knockdown power for an animal, which is what everybody wants to see. The problem is that a piece the size of a head of a pin is enough to kill a condor. And when you've got 547 fragments just in this little snapshot, and you're talking about condors who are not tidy eaters, if anybody's ever seen them feeding, they're going at it. I mean, this could take out half a flock right here if enough animals got into it without treatment. So we studied turkey vultures and common ravens to see, are they being impacted by lead? And the results were about what we expected. So this is a graph of our turkey vulture population specifically. And so we're the bar on the far left that says 24%. So that means about 1 in 4 of the turkey vultures that we studied had a blood lead level that would be considered a problem in Condor. So 1 in 4 had elevated blood lead levels. Now, turkey vultures are not the same as condors. They do metabolize differently, but this study allowed us to compare similar studies that were being done in places where condors currently persisted. So, because these studies have been done throughout California, to say, well, what is the relative problem? But so, for example, again, I think that our low human populations do actually benefit in a certain way, because even our near neighbor county, Mendocino County, where they did a similar study, they actually had about 36% blood lead elevation in the turkey vultures that they studied. So we do have apparently lower impact from the use of lead ammunition in this area. And so this graph right here focuses on turkey vultures only. You can see that the Mendocino study has both a deer hunt season and an outside of deer hunt season. And that kind of shows the clear difference of lead contamination in turkey vultures within and without. So the 30%, we were only able to study our turkey vultures outside of hunting season because they're actually migrating during hunting season. And that means that any results that we find, we couldn't know if their contamination level was local or being brought in. So what you want to do there is you want to compare the 24 to 36% to show that we've got lower levels outside of hunting season, but then you also want to see that it's a clear problem correlated with hunting season, because you can look at the 36 and the 66%, the red and the blue, that's outside and inside of hunting season within Mendocino County, and there's a clear elevation in blood lead levels in their turkey vultures. And so we actually were able to study that different seasonality with our common ravens because they're non-migratory, and we saw that same pattern. We had lower levels outside of hunting season and higher levels within hunting season. So it's a pretty good guess that hunting season is going to be impacting the lead levels in our region. Knowing that, because it's a problem all across Condor country, we actually right off the bat started our Hunters as Stewards project on the assumption that there would be some level of contamination in our area. And so the Hunters as Stewards program was specifically designed to reach out to the hunting community, which has a strong conservation ethic. These are the people who like to be in the outdoors and to have a full complexity of an environment around them, to say, hey, partner with us in condor conservation. And so this entailed listening to hunter concerns and communicating our information about the use of lead and alternative non-lead ammunition clearly to them in order to help them make the decision to make a transition to non-lead ammunition. Basically, that lead is a toxic material and non-lead ammunition is better for wildlife and for you and your family and your friends. And we actually were very successful. We did some kind of preliminary survey sort of work with the people that we talked to, and depending on the event, anywhere from 85 to 95% of the hunters that we talked to said, I had no idea this was an issue. And of course, I'll make a switch to non-lead ammunition. And of course, since then, there's actually been a ban that's been put in place in California, banning the use of ammunition for hunting throughout California. And there's some pluses and there's some negatives to that. So we had been having a lot of success with our kind of volunteer program that we've been espousing. These sort of things are replicated throughout condor recovery areas. They've got a very successful one at the Tiana Wildlife Society, Pinnacles, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service site. Actually, the Peregrine Fund has a release site in Arizona, and they've had very successful volunteer efforts there as well. But a lot of the push for the lead ban was actually couched in terms of condor conservation. And while we had a lot of success with the individuals that we talked to, it was kind of really on a one-on-one basis, changing everybody's mind individually on this particular topic. So when the lead ban came in place with condor kind of as its flagship bird species, there was some negative reaction to that. And a lot of doors that we had had open to us to listen got slammed in our faces after that. And I think that was a bit of a kind of immediate reaction sort of thing. These doors are opening back up. There's been more opportunity to talk to the hunting community about why this is a problem, not only for condors, but also for bald and golden eagles who are just as susceptible to it. And so we're getting back to a good place. And ultimately, lead has got to get out of the system for a variety of reasons. So this is probably a good step in that direction. But it's definitely going to continue to require a lot more work and a lot of personal engagement with our hunting community to help them understand why this is so important. Myself, I am a hunter. I come from a hunting community, a hunting family. I made the transition pretty seamlessly, but we're always open to talking to people about it if anybody's got more questions. This was kind of the approach that we took all across the Condor program, though, to establish formal support from partners, because a lot of people have concern when you're talking about bringing an endangered species back to an area which hasn't seen it in so long, because there are practical impacts to how you do your business when you've got a new endangered species to consider. But this approach of going to people and listening to their concerns and saying, okay, how do we address this in a good way, brokered us tons of support from our local community. And so we actually developed a memorandum of understanding with 16 parties on it, ranging from federal to state to industry to utility to nonprofit to tribal partners, all coming together to say that not only would moving condors back up here again, bringing them home, be good for condors, but it would actually be good for our region. So we started drafting that in 2012, and we got our last signature on it in 2018, and have just been flying since then. Oof. So that's the last kind of 14 years of my life. The next and kind of final stage of the presentation is what's next for condors on the north coast of California. So we have, for the last, really since 2016, we've been working towards the regulatory requirements required under the National Environmental Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act, which is necessary if you're going to be dealing with an endangered species and if you're talking about doing work within a federally protected area, so like the national parklands where we're going to be releasing them. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed that the reintroduced population be reintroduced as a non-essential experimental population under Section 10J of the Endangered Species Act. And that was one of three alternatives, the preferred alternative under the environmental assessment. Those three alternatives being no action, designation as 10J, and then designation as ESA fully protected. So the reason for the 10J specifically was it kind of arose out of that memorandum of understanding, out of that partnership building, because condors actually are extremely adaptable animals. Like I mentioned, lead actually is the major issue for them. It's 50% of known mortality for condor in the wild comes from the use of lead ammunition and through lead contamination. They've actually done statistics to say that if we can get rid of lead, we could actually probably stop managing condors because they're so adaptable, because they do so well. It's just such a major hit. So we didn't actually see a lot of negative interactions to be happening with just business as usual up here in Northern California. But the 10J rule specifically allows you to designate 4D rules that identify those specific needs of the species to make sure that they're prioritized as being protected. So basically the approach is you look at the species, you look at the species need, you craft the specific rules that prioritize condor restoration above anything else, and then relax what isn't as necessary for condor restoration. In any case, this was a huge endeavor. We started in 2016. There was literally thousands of comments, largely in support, but some with just some really great constructive feedback on what our approach was going to be. And so it took years to get all of the comments addressed. Ultimately, it resulted in a finding of no significant impact through the environmental assessment, which was received on March 23rd of this year, 2021. And that was kind of our final go. You are now authorized to bring condor home, which was an amazing moment for us. So along with that, there's a lot of kind of agreements that have to be built because, as we say, it takes a village to raise a condor. It's not something that the Yurok Tribe or even the Yurok Tribe and the National Park Service can do alone. So there's been a lot of drafting of new agreements related to bird treatments, facility uses, partner roles and responsibilities. We've submitted management plans and permit applications to both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. which are coming to fruition and will be in hand very shortly. We're working on a cooperative agreement with our partner Redwood National and State Parks to really delineate what each of our roles are going to be in condor recovery. We've been working on a lot of the infrastructure needs. We've been working on our Condor Management and Operations Center. It was actually built out of what was a soon to be demolished Redwood National Park building. It was their Old South Operations Center. We call it Old South Operations Center or Old SOC. And it had been slated for demolition, but we secured funding from the Administration of Native Americans to renovate it. And it's looking a lot nicer these days. And this is going to be our primary office space. So office and storage space, it's going to have a walk-in freezer for carcasses. There's going to be a workshop area. It's basically the staging area for our field operations. We've also been working on developing local treatment facilities. The other existing treatment facilities that help the Condor program are primarily focused in Central and Southern California. So it's like a 6 to 7 hour drive at minimum from our site. So we've been working with our local Sequoia Park Zoo, which is actually the only AZA certified zoo up in our region, to build something like this, which is a condor treatment. I believe this is, oh man, I think this is the LA Zoo site, but it might be in San Diego. I'm totally blanking right now. Day's getting on. But in any case, this is a bit of a schematic of what they're going to be building at the Sequoia Park Zoo. So it allows for both keeping birds in a group. They're actually very communal birds, so that they like to be in a group, or isolating birds if they're particularly ill or need particular care. It's not going to be an intensive care center, which they do actually have condor ICUs, but it's going to be enough that if there are minor injuries, they can treat them there, or if a bird needs stabilization before being flown or driven out to kind of one of the more intense treatment areas, that they can do so. So it's just been an amazing partnership. Oh man, I forgot to change this slide. I say here, we're finalizing the design of the release and management facility, but we have actually broken ground and are getting close to getting it built at this point. And so this is an example of a release and management facility. This is the Pinnacles National Park site, actually. And so it's comprised of 3 parts. You've kind of got the biggest area there. It's actually the release pen, or excuse me, the flight pen, where birds will spend the majority of their time. There's an observation room, which is where we observe the birds, as you might expect, but it's also where, if they need treatment or care or, a closer look, we can capture and handle them and treat them in that observation room. And there's also what's known as the double door trap, which kind of serves like a funnel. You'll actually put a carcass in there as a lure, and then you can use that to selectively capture birds or release birds that you want to bring into or out of the facility. This is an example of a similar structure at Ventana Wildlife Society. You guys, if you're watching, you may have known that this facility actually burned down, and so they've been rebuilding it. But this was the last site that they had similar structure. Our site is going to more closely mimic the Ventana Wildlife Society site at San Simeon, actually. The other site's closer to the kind of the Big Sur area. And so this design is neat because we've even modified it a little bit further, but it's entirely mobile. So now we went through a lot of work to kind of figure out what we think would be the best site for a release facility, and it'll serve great, I'm sure, but these birds can fly as much as 100 to 200 miles in a day. So if at some point the condor flock says, hey, we don't like it anymore here, we can actually pick up this facility and move it someplace else entirely. It's also going to be nearly 100% fireproof. And so there's actually been more than one release facility that has lost a fire. And of course, fire is only going to be more and more of a problem in California as the drought and climate change continue to impact our environment. So this is going to be a really good structure for us that helps meet the needs of our condor program in Northern California. So we've actually, like I said, we've broken ground on it. We've brought in already some of the major structures that will be the observation pen and then some support structures as well. We're starting to build a perimeter fence, which is primarily meant to keep predators out. We have a lot of bears here. We have a lot of cats here. So it'll have an electrified fence, and we'll also have a 12-foot fence that hopefully should keep most predators out. And then the rest of the actual release and management facility will be created out of these custom fabricated steel pen panels that again have that fireproof capacity. We're building it right now. We're kind of finalizing the last of our condor management strategies. That's a part of the permitting process, and just to make sure that we do what we need to do for them. And it tends to be what people are really interested. How are you going to actually manage these birds? How is this going to look? And so what we're looking at is releasing 6 birds per year for the next 20 years. We receive birds at about 2 years of age, which is still considered to be a juvenile for a bird, but it's about the age that if they're in the wild, the parents would be kind of releasing them off to be on their own. So they're perfectly capable at that age, if still young. The birds will be allowed to acclimatize in the field release and management facility for several months, kind of hones in that this is their new home. And then releases will occur as pairs or singly. And so that allows us the opportunity to really watch birds as they're released and make sure that they're doing well out in the wild before we add another bird into the mix. I mentioned before that birds are very communal, so letting out 1 or 2 birds at a time also helps cue them into the release and management facility, which will continue to be used throughout the life of the project, because they see that their buddies are still inside and they like to hang out with their buddies. So we've actually had our first cohort of birds assigned to us, only for this year. There's quite a bit of need in the Condor program, and all of the birds are managed according to their lineage and genetics and sex. And every year they go through a process to determine what birds go where. But so we're going to be receiving 4 birds, which are 1 female and 3 males. They are currently actually staged at the Tiana Wildlife Society. They're a really great partner. So they're kind of getting them used to being out in the wild. They came from the rearing facilities, the breeding facilities. They've never actually been out in the wild. So they're currently hanging out in their facility until they get transferred up here when ours is ready to go, hopefully by February. You can see there's a link in here. You can go to the Tiana Wildlife Society if you like, and they've got a Condor Cam website, and they've got one that lists the San Simeon site, and that's where these birds are being held. It's actually, as far as I know, it's only our birds in there right now. So if you want to go see our birds, that's where you can find them. I'll try to remember to put this link into it, into the chat at the end of the presentation. But we'll also be bringing in mentors from the zoos, and mentors are adult birds that for whatever reason never could be released, or which were released but didn't do well in the wild and so can't be released. And so they won't be released, but they will hang out in the facility to kind of help teach the young birds how to be condors. And so that includes things like establishing dominance hierarchies or focusing their attention on adult type behaviors. And again, they kind of act as social magnets. Even once all of our young birds are released, they'll cue into that mentor bird and kind of keep that facility in mind, and keep it on their mental map. That mentor bird will eventually go back, but hopefully by that point, the birds will have established this as their home. So every bird will receive a single wing-mounted satellite transmitter with an alphanumeric visual tag, and as well as a radio transmitter. And so we use satellite and radio for kind of different applications. The satellite is more analysis of home ranges, risks, their use of habitat and important resources. And it also allows us to identify where on the landscape they're showing up and using the land, so we can identify landowners and managers with key resources of interest to condors and reach out to them directly and form partnerships. The tags all have a mortality signal, which prompts investigation if a transmitter doesn't move for a specified period of time. We know that we have to go check out that bird. We'll have crews out every day using the radio transmitters and receivers to actually lay eyes on the birds as much as possible, so we can check out and make sure that they're doing okay, that they seem to be interacting well with each other and with the environment. Those radio transmitters are really good for that on the ground tracking of the birds. It's pretty typical that all of the sites host at least biannual trap-ups in the spring and the fall. And so these trap-ups are something that we'll do as well. That's another reason for the release and management facility. They include a physical check, transmitter and tag maintenance. We do blood draws for lead contamination and disease checking and things like that. And to date, the trap-ups at the other site have been a really great opportunity for us and our partners to gain condor handling experience and just kind of experience with their managerial styles, which we've all kind of rolled into our own management planning. Our lead, I mean, I joined this fresh out of college and actually had never met a condor, probably before a year into the Yurok Tribe Wildlife Department program. But our lead biologist, Chris, he's actually in the lower right corner there, has worked with condors for 20 years. So he already brought a wealth of experience, and this just added to it. This is another example, actually working with the Oregon Zoo. They're one of the breeding and rearing facilities out of the Portland area. And so we sent our Sequoia Park Zoo staff up there to learn condor handling and treatment as well. So there's just been a lot of really great partnerships helping make this happen. This is a picture of me in the middle. That was actually my first exposure to condor at the Tiana Wildlife Society. Releasing a bird just kind of gives you a bit of a perspective on how big these birds really are. So when I talk about teaching us about condor management and handling, it's both for the safety of the birds and for the safety of us as staff. Ultimately, the long-term vision for condor restoration in our area is that the lower human populations in the Pacific Northwest may reduce that kind of human condor conflict that we're seeing in other places. We will release approximately 120 birds over the next 20 years. And of course, that's not accounting for what we will hopefully see, which is wild reproduction. And so Northern California really, though, is just the next phase of condor recovery in the Pacific Northwest. You kind of can see this expanding red image here. That's based off of some GIS analyses of what seems to be good condor habitat throughout the Pacific Northwest, both from kind of a geospatial perspective, but then also rolling into traditional stories of where condors used to thrive. So we think that they'll definitely head northward and kind of hit that Columbia River and head east, hopefully sooner rather than later. Interestingly, there's actually another tribe, the Nez Perce, currently kind of based out of Idaho, who are looking at a release area in the Hells Canyon area. They're quite a bit of ways behind us. They're kind of like where we were about 10 years ago, but they're very committed, and I'm very excited for someday our condor flocks meeting in the middle. Ultimately, of course, our dream is birds without tags that we don't have to manage because their numbers are so abundant. I'm getting to the close here. It's been kind of a long presentation. I appreciate your attention. I just always like to close with, I'm really honored and proud to be doing this as a tribal member because of this idea of restoration across generations. Because I spoke to why it's so important to our elders, I spoke to why it's so important to our community members, but I'm really excited that my daughter, pictured here when she was brand new, will be amongst the first generation of Yurok tribal members to grow up with condors in her sky. She's never going to know what it means to not have condors there. She's excited about them. She's asking for pictures of Prey-go-neesh and she's asking for videos. And I don't know. I'm just happy to be a part of restoration for her world. Ultimately, this is what we envision: condors central to our ecosystem, central to our cultural narrative again. Condors part and parcel of the Yurok world again. With that, I like to say thank you to just some of our partners. This doesn't even begin to cover the full scope of our partners, but it would take 2 or 3 or possibly 4 slides this pack to even get there. And I'll say my waklau, or sincere thanks to you as well. I haven't quite checked the chat, but Ariana said she was going to put some of these links in there. So we've got both our Yurok Tribe Wildlife Department website, which gives a lot of history of our program, and then also our Yurok Condor Restoration Program Facebook page, which is where we kind of put our more often we put our updates and the like. And with that, I'll just say thanks, and I appreciate your attention, and that's it for me.
Thank you so much. Let's see, I got the Facebook one in, and let me get the wildlife one in there. So both of those links are in the chat. So thank you so much for making the time to speak to our group. This was a fantastic presentation, and we are looking forward to hearing updates about your program. So I think I'll start with the questions I see here in the chat. Did lead in vultures, ravens increase during hunting season because hunting kill is butchered in the field and parts with lead left there for scavengers?
That does seem to be a lot of the issue. It's particularly an issue when lead gets into the gut pile, which is typically left behind by hunters. And that gut pile is actually really good food for scavengers, and it exemplifies why hunters are such an important part of the ecosystem these days. I mean, in part, it's because our predator prey balance has been so disrupted by predator kills and loss of our predator populations, but humans play an important predator role these days. But it's problematic when these gut piles, which are normally good food, are studded with lead contamination. So you can also just lose an animal, of course, and then that animal is contaminated if it just goes someplace else to die. We are encountering the problem in California that there's just a real shortage of ammunition, both lead and non-lead. So we're talking to people about making the switch, and it's hard for them to find the ammunition to make the switch. So while we 100%, of course, espouse complying with California law and hunting only with non-lead ammunition, if it comes down to it and an animal is harvested with lead ammunition, we really just propose that people gather up their gut pile and haul it out instead of leaving it behind. There's a website called Project Gut Pile that talks about the importance of that. It was actually started a long time ago before the ban, but it's an alternative way to make sure that lead isn't getting into the system.
And another question, how large a team of people do you have for this project? I'm impressed with how elaborate it is.
Oh my God, there's not nearly enough of us. We have 2 dedicated staff to the Condor program right now. Our Condor program manager, Chris West, and his lead field biologist, Patrick Myers. So I started as a wildlife technician back in the day, back in 2008, and have matriculated my way up to the directorship of the wildlife department. And so for a long time there, I was very Condor focused, but the Yurok Tribe Wildlife Department has grown so much. I mean, we're working with other threatened and endangered species. We're working with like habitat restoration, ungulate restoration, and all these other wildlife projects, invasive species removal. I don't have nearly enough time to be as engaged with condors as I wish that I did because I've got all these diverse priorities. When we bring condors back, so basically to talk about everything that we've done, it's been Chris and I for a long time, and then thankfully we added Patrick as well as some other staff that have been in and out since then. When we bring condors back, we'll also have a team of 4 interns who will do a lot of the on-the-ground tracking of the birds, while Chris and Patrick serve as primary leads in the management. And we're hoping to add a full-time technician after that to kind of give some flexibility, honestly, for poor Chris and Patrick for like the next, I don't know, 6 to 7 months after we bring condors home and before we hire this 3rd technician. It's just going to be them. So that means no vacation, no sick time, no anything, because monitoring the birds is 24 hours per day, 7 days per week if there's a problem. So it's a small crew and I'm hoping to grow it more, but we've got a lot of passion and commitment to get this done.
I guess on that topic, if people are interested and want to support the program, they go to the yuroktribe.org website to make a donation, or is there another way that
they do,
they can
yeah.
support?
If you want to go to the wildlife page, it's that first link up there. We have a little Condor button down at the bottom that says donate. And so that goes directly to the Condor program exclusively. I'll throw in there, it's through PayPal and it keeps failing. There's some sort of like online code that keeps changing and we have to go to our IT department and say, hey, go fix it. So if you do care to support us that way and it doesn't work for some reason, just give us an email. There, you can find a way to email us on the Yurok Tribe website and we'll fix it because it's hard to monitor, but that's the best way. Or you can reach out to us directly if you've got other ideas.
And is there any other way people can support the program or any other ideas?
Well, if you're ever in the region, volunteers are going to be a really important part of it. Even with a crew of 4 on every day, that's really split into 2 teams. So we're going to have 2 interns tracking the birds every day at any given point, because we do want to give them a little bit of a break sometimes. So they're split into 2 teams. So we're going to need people who are helping us actually track birds. Citizen science is going to be a huge thing. We're going to need people working with the National Park Service to be interpreters if you're interested in that. If anybody wants to talk to their hunting friends about lead ammunition, a really great website is huntingwithnonlead.org. Talks about the science of why this is important, the ecology, the biology, but then also talks about how to make the switch if you're interested in it. Other than that, I mean, good thoughts, prayers. I mean, I think they make a difference for sure.
Some more questions here are, and thank you for suggesting ways people can support the program, because we can see people are very interested and excited. Are condors reproducing in the wild?
They definitely are in the places where they're currently been reintroduced. There's very active wild populations being born. I remember, well, it's been a few years back now, but at the Ventana Wildlife Society, it was just the coolest thing to me. They had a bird that for a while there they called Mystery, because they thought that there had been a wild chick born, but they couldn't find the nest because, I mean, it's way the heck up there. They tend to nest in high places and they couldn't find the nest until eventually this young juvenile just kind of floats out of the sky and into their view, and there he was. So basically, the parents had managed to fully rear that chick without any sort of intervention from the Ventana Wildlife Society, to adulthood. And so that was a very exciting thing. But yes, there is wild reproduction going on out there successfully. Not enough to combat the mortality rate yet. Like I mentioned, lead still being an issue, but they're doing what they got to do.
Nice. Are tribal members directly involved with this project, i.e. hands-on participation?
Well, there's me. I mean, I'm a tribal member. Other than that, there's within the tribal government, there's quite a few tribal members who are being involved. For example, they're called our watershed department. They're kind of our roads departments. They make sure that our roads are kept in good repair so that as people drive over them, there's not like sedimentation in the creeks and rivers, and we can get out to our lands to do active management and things like that. But they're heavy equipment operators. So they've actually been helping quite a bit with the building of the release management facility itself. Of course, I engage regularly with our tribal elders on how we're going to do this and what our relationship with condors are. We consider them to be our community members. So everything that we want to do with a respectful appreciation for them. There's been tribal members who have helped us out with the non-lead outreach. We've had volunteers just come out to try and get these various, to get the RMF, the release and management facility going. So yeah, there's a lot of local tribal excitement about what's going on, and often people asking, well, how do we help out? For sure.
And this question, I'm not says I have heard condors have been spotted near Mount D. I'm assuming that's Mount Diablo. Any truth to that?
I don't think so. Not that
Maybe,
I've
hey,
heard.
well, I can see. Hey, Juan Pablo, do you want to answer that question? Do you want to unmute and answer that question? No, maybe he left. No, he left. Anyway, Mount Diablo posted something on their website about a condor being spotted, or no, it flew into Contra Costa County for the first time. I don't know exactly if it was.
I did hear about that. I don't know specifically about Mount Diablo, but I did hear about that. And it seems like every year you're hearing about how they're pushing northward. They keep getting closer and closer to the Bay Area, and then they're also wrapping around in the Sierras to push north and north. I don't know if you guys can remember looking at that kind of red wishbone. That was kind of the last place that they were seen in the 1950s. They've refilled that out, and they're just expanding northward from there. So I do remember that now.
Will you have to put out carcasses for them to feed on like they do in Big Sur?
Yes, we will. Particularly for this first little bit, like I said, we're bringing out juveniles, and we're honestly going to have to be their parents for a little bit, because in the wild, of course, when a juvenile is kind of released to be on his own, he's not really on his own. Usually, what a pair of parents will do is they'll kind of drop their juvenile bird into a pack of other juvenile birds, and I always think of them as like a roving pack of teenagers. Which is a good thing because they've got the support of each other, but on the other hand, they're a roving pack of teenagers, so they can get into trouble too. But in the same way, the juvenile of 2 years old has been raised by its parents, and so he's already learned where all the good places to eat, where all the good ways to fly are, and our birds are not initially going to have that to support them. So we're going to have to provide them a lot of support in that way, making sure that they get the food resources that they need. until they've really figured out our landscape. And then they'll be the people teaching the new juveniles coming in. Now, that said, even after our population is established, we continue to proffer food at the release and management sites or other well-known sites to the birds in order to help manage them, because we want them to come back in for those biannual checkups. And we want to make sure that their behavior is doing well and things like that in a place that we can watch them behave, you know. So at that point, it becomes more of a management tool rather than a support tool. But it will be important for these first few years to help these birds get their wings under them, so to speak.
Great. And I'll just read some other comments. Thank you so much. Thank you. Terrific presentation. Excellent presentation. Thank you. Stay the course. What an amazing presentation. Thank you for your work with condors. Wow, what a great presentation and program. Thank you so much. Excellent program. Thank you. Great presentation of your program. Thank you. Really informative and great work. What's the best and safest way to see condors in the wild?
Well, it's going to be a little bit for us. We'll be receiving the birds in February with hope for releases in April, which I'm actually not sure that I said earlier. Our condors will probably stay pretty close to home for that first little bit, or at least we're hoping, as we figure out how to manage them and how this will really play out. But particularly if you go to the existing sites, there tends to be a lot of interpretation about the best sites to see them. If you go to the Grand Canyon, there's all kinds of information about the best places to see them. You're definitely not going to want to get up and close and personal with a bird. Keep your distance, put your binoculars on them, go to these places where they're well known to be seen. And if you're lucky, you could actually get a pretty cool and close encounter with a bird, either perched nearby or even flying right over your head. They're very curious birds. But yeah, just treat them like any other wild animal. Of course, you don't want to interact too closely with them, but check out the particular sites that you'd want to see. So there's the Southern California site, the Peregrine sites, Society site, and then Ventana and Pinnacles, and they should be able to point you to good condor viewing locations.
Back to your remark about interpreters via the National Park Service. Are you referring to interpreters working for National Park Service or for the tribe, or a combination thereof?
It's actually an interesting question. We actually meet with Redwood National Park every week, particularly as this gets closer and closer to make sure that things are playing out smoothly. We just had that conversation today. Probably one of the primary roles, or not one of the primary roles, but one of the roles that the National Park Service will play is managing interpretation. Because especially with our crew being so small, we're really going to need our guys on the ground doing the actual biology and management of the birds. And while we love to talk condors, I mean, people can talk about condors for an hour and we have to be chasing the birds. So interpretive volunteers will probably be funneled through Redwood National and state parks. Now, there will be other interpretation that is kind of one of the neat parts of this tribal national park partnership, which is really focusing on the tribal aspect of things. But of course, that'll probably be handled by tribal members more than volunteer interpreters. So long story short, probably the parks will be the ones to kind of manage that interpretive aspect.
Well, thank you for answering all the questions. This was really awesome, and we love hearing about condors. So thank you again for making the time to speak to our chapter. I think we have some guests from other chapters and maybe all over the country. I was getting emails, but thank you, and I'll let you get back to your gingerbread house with your daughter.
I think, I don't know if she came through with her squealing or not. It was definitely close to bedtime. I think that she's actually gone to bed now. But
oh no.
Thanks for that. And again, thanks for the opportunity to share. I know it was a little bit stuttery because of all the chaos that was going on behind me.
I understand.
So I appreciate that.
All right, well, we'll just keep looking for updates, and thank you again for all the great work that you're doing.
Thank you all as well. And you have a great night.
Okay. Bye, everyone. See you next month.